move through these topics, it's a lot. And so we want you to spend time, each of us should spend time taking just some notes and then review these notes over the next 5 weeks as we're going through this. I think it's a very wonderful educational program. So into the topic of slavery. So I like to recognize that contextually we have to understand that slavery in what was described at the time as the New World or the transatlantic world really begins following the arrival of Columbus. And if those of us who remember our history, Columbus's first voyage was in 1492. And the first group of people that were put in forced labor in this Western Hemisphere were the native communities that lived here, right? The Spaniards called it an encomienda system. And that system existed for about 100 years. So the Spanish and the Portuguese had a system of doing that before the Africans were brought in to fill what was the gap that the Spaniards had ultimately created by committing genocide against the natives that lived here. I know that the heart of our conversation is about African slavery, but we can't forget that prior to African slavery in this hemisphere, natives were also subject to forced labor and lost their rights and their geography, their home here as well. African slavery begins again in the 1500s, beginning in the Spanish territories in places like Hispaniola. We now know that place as the Dominican Republic. And then it would come to what would become the United States, the English-speaking world, really in the 1600s. And in that period of the 1600s, you saw the British Empire stretch out of Europe and make an attempt to break the Spanish Empire. And if you remember a little bit of your history, the Spanish and the Portuguese had literally cut the world in two. So if you remember Marco Polo and the history of Marco Polo, he goes to the eastern side of the world and lays claim to Africa and India. And Columbus comes to the western side and is given claim to what would become the Americas. And so slavery dates back to that period of time. So sometimes when we talk about slavery as a 300-year phenomenon. It's actually more than that, because if you date it back to the time of the Spaniards, you have to add an additional 200 years. The British version of what would happen begins in the so-called American colonies. First, blacks are brought in to plant tobacco and then ultimately cotton and other kinds of things. So what happens after slavery ends? So I give you the backstory just to be clear that when we think about if slavery is a system that is impacting by this time, the late 1800s, it's impacting all over the Caribbean, English speaking, French speaking, Spanish speaking. When we say the end of slavery, it's not like we can think of it as, oh, there was this date and then it's over and everybody goes home and goes back to live life the way, they might have wanted it to be. No, right. It's a long, protracted struggle that eventually destroys the system of slavery, right?
So Basiyr Sahib, I think that's a good highlight you mentioned there, because a lot of people might think that there was an announcement that was made to say, okay, from now moving forward, no one is allowed to have slaves. So you're saying that didn't happen. It wasn't just like one day and then everything ended. Okay.
That did not happen. So the first powerful nation to outlaw the traffic of slaves. So we have to also see slavery as a process, right? So transatlantic slavery as a process. One part of the process is the capture of African people from West Africa, right? Mm-hmm. So that is a process in and of itself. You go there, you disrupt the communities there, you take ships there, and then you create war and strife, and then you force the people there into slavery. So you capture some people and you walk them off of the mainland of West Africa from countries as far north in West Africa. If you see a geography, if we had space, we'd show you a map. Or as far north as Nigeria and Ghana, along this circle, it's called the Bight of Benin. It would then capture parts of all the way down to Cameroon. So Africans would be taken from these places, put on ships, and then they would be transported. This is the trafficking part, the second phase. And then they would be enslaved in the Americas. So I paint a picture just so we can understand that, number one, each of those things had to somehow be disrupted. So the British say, look, we outlawed the traffic in slaves in 1808, right? They said, we outlawed the traffic in Africans, and we have to use our terms clearly here. Terms matter. So, right, so we are enslaved Africans. And the British outlawed that trafficking in 1808. And you kind of remember why they would outlaw this traffic, right? The American nation had been born in 1776. And the British argument was, if we can't control you anymore, then you can't traffic slaves anymore. And at this time, the British have one of the largest armadas in the world, the largest navies in the world. So they can enforce the breaking of the traffic, right? So in 1808 is when trafficking ends.
Okay.
Then
I think
go ahead.
Basiyr Saab, let's we'll come back to that timeline, right? We'll come back to that timeline, and let's talk about. I know that was a whole phase that happened. So we've learned that it wasn't just one day that this ended, but through time. Well, okay, Manan Saab, let's come to you now. We know that through time there was some sort of that whole system broke down, right? If you can fast forward to that time when we can now say, okay, Black people, we know you went through all of this slavery, and then they did a lot of wrong things to you. But then at some point, come on, man, you were free, right? And now that you've called yourself free people, are you not then, were they not able to then move freely to go and work like everybody else was working and earn a living? Manan Saab, wouldn't that be a fair question?
So that's a fair question, but I also develop a correlation between what happened in the past couple of months up till now, where we had protests due to a gentleman by the name of George Floyd being killed by a police officer. Within that process of the protests happening and then protests kind of dying down and up till now, Black people have been experiencing a kind of a resurgence of white privilege guilt, right? And so the white people have been saying, hey, you know what? This is what I have, and this is what, you know, I can give you. And similar, if we press the rewind button, after, you know, what we quote unquote the end of slavery during the Reconstruction period, that's what exactly happened. White people, they kind of, you know, rescinded their offers of slavery, and, you know, Black people were kind of moving around and kind of joined the Republican fold. The Democrats were actually racist. You know, the Republicans were the ones who accepted the Black people. Black people were experiencing some sort of freedom. But what happened was we know that because slavery was an economic process, that they were just regrouping. So they lost that battle, right? Because we have to remember, even if we go back, the battle of the Civil War, during the Civil War, it was 250,000 white people that did not fight in the Civil War. They actually were the first conscientious objectors in American history, but multiple wars up to that point. And 180,000 Black people joined the forces of the Union in order to fight the battle for, you know, what we call the United States, and then, or the Union, and then for their freedom. That's what they were sold. But what they didn't know was that they were also sold the 40 acres and a mule after their freedom. But then, and I'm jumping forward, but then the lie was, hey, we're gonna give you 40 acres and a mule as long as you do this for us. As soon as the change happened, the story dropped, and the government paid the slave owners the money and the privileges of the people that were doing the labor for the slave owners. So,
okay, so it was like, it wasn't just saying now you're free, you can go wherever you want and do whatever you want. There were things that were kind of keeping them stuck, if I'm getting you right.
Everything kept them stuck. Everything kept them stuck. However, they did have some level of freedom as the Confederacy regrouped. And during that period of regrouping, people started to develop groups such as the Ku Klux Klan.
Okay, so Abdul-Hai, you know, they're talking about there's this sort of system where those slaves, I'm sure people say they were mainly in the South or whatnot. The United States was huge, right? If you know that now you're free, if you know that, you know, because we say it, if you're in an unsafe neighborhood, you go to a safer neighborhood, right? You move around, you go to a new environment and find a new way of living. Couldn't they, at least some of them, couldn't they have just moved and go to another place and just start fresh now that they've been given this? They're not in bondage per se, physically at least. Wasn't that possible, Abdullah?
Well, yeah, I mean, this absolutely took place, and you know, it was called the Great Migration. You know, where individuals moved from the South up to the North and established communities. You know, and eventually started the Harlem Renaissance. You know, an incredible movement of poetry and jazz. You know, and just arts and culture in general. But you know, the question always remains is, you know, could we move? Could we migrate? The question is, to where? Right?
Mm-hmm.
There's one thing that's consistent in the United States, and it's always been there, and it's been, you know, it's woven into the fabric of the United States. There are two groups of people that the United States can't stand. And, you know, I don't see this changing. One, foundational Black Americans or American descendants of slaves. And then two is women, right? These are the two groups of people that have always been oppressed in some way, shape, or form. Right. So, you know, I know we've talked about this multiple times, but, you know, these communities that have been established, and when Black communities did migrate from South Carolina to Arkansas, to Tulsa, Oklahoma, to Rosewood, to St. Louis, to Fayetteville, North Carolina, so on and so forth, somehow, some way, those communities, after they built themselves up, you know, and built an economic infrastructure, it was always undermined by this mechanism of immorality. Right? And it's something that we call white supremacy now, or racism, right? But the crux of the whole thing is immorality. And that immorality attacks and is conveyed through economics. And if you destroy the economic infrastructure of any group of people, you're going to end up with an oppressed people and a dependent people over and over again.
So did you, when you said they built those communities, could you clarify that when Black people traveled into these new settlements, what do you mean by building those communities? What did they actually do?
So built these communities, right? Built houses, residential areas, schools, hospitals, banks, just small businesses, right? It was completely Black owned. It was a completely Black enterprise. It was a complete Black economic infrastructure. And,
right.
You know, the immorality, or what we convey as white supremacy, was threatened by that. And that immorality, the first thing they did is they attacked and they destroyed these communities. And when people destroy communities and take away an economic infrastructure, the natural, what's going to entail that is naturally criminality, right? So that is naturally what takes place. Criminality isn't something that we're designed with, right? We're Ahmadi Muslims. We know how Allah has designed us, right? This is something we yearn for, our creator, the independent, the Basiyr of all. But shaitan, or that immorality, takes that away from you and undermines you, and you get this fear of poverty. So you end up start to pursue criminality in some way, shape, or form. That's the crux of criminality. People aren't born that way, right? So if you establish justice, right, of what Hazrat Adam, alayhi salam, what he was given by Allah, what his mission was, right, was to provide food, clothes, water, shelter, education to mankind. You can minimize or almost eradicate criminality.
Right. So okay, Manansa, I'll come to you. Now this environment that was newly created, Black people went in, they found their settlements, they built their families, but then this cancer started coming in, it started disrupting their family. And he talked about criminality, and we know that, you know, people then incarceration and all of those things started happening, imprisonment. Now, but then, you know, not everyone goes to jail forever. Somebody can say, well, okay, that happened, they made mistakes, it wasn't their fault that immorality came, they were involved in crime, they got locked up. But surely if somebody was to go through that and they came out, they should have learned from their lesson and know that, okay, these aren't things that I should do again. That's still not, is that still, I mean, one could say it's still not an excuse. You learn from your lessons, you move forward. But why is it that we still find that phase of this imprisonment and going back and forth to prison? Why that? How is that justified?
We have to, I think let's rewind. The system of American imprisonment is completely wrong. It's completely immoral. It started from the system of the overseer on the plantation, where the overseer or the officer was the person looking after and also penalizing the slaves on the plantation. So number one. Number two is that when after Reconstruction, there had to have been an economic system placed in the pockets of the people who were looking after and also enslaving the slaves in this system. So what did they do? They developed a process called the police, that where those people, whoever they were, being Black folk, men, women, children, would be penalized and also caught and placed in a jail cell or a prison or on a chain gang for minor and also major violations. Now, out of all the people, let's say there's 12,000 African people in America, they probably were placing a good 10% of them in prison. So, but we still have that amount here in America. It's almost the same amount, and probably even higher. So we have to remember that if a person, especially Black people, when they go to jail, the system, the prison system or the judicial system is one-sided, and it's one-sided due to the historical basis of the judicial system out of the slavery seed. So
right.
Yes, I think this is a larger
right.
subject than we are experiencing now.
Right.
For example, keep going.
Yeah, so no, go ahead. You can finish your point. And I was going to come to Basiyr Rodney after that.
Yeah. So I have a story. My grandfather was born in 1895, and in Little Rock, in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, and it's my father's father. Him and his friend at age 13, 1908, were going to a general store. They encountered this young white lady, it's almost the same age, young white girl, and the white girl liked my grandfather's best friend. He didn't like her, so he said something rude, and she went back and told her father. Her father went and told his posse of white men. They went to a church on a Wednesday. They went to a church, grabbed this boy from the pastor's arms, took him outside, closed the doors of the church, and hung this boy from the tree outside of the church. Put his penis in his mouth, and they left. Now, none of the men were persecuted, but if a Black man did that then, if he would have killed a white man then, he would have been killed, and the rest of the town would have been burned, just like they did Tulsa, Oklahoma, Rosewood, Green. So it's so one-sided that right. I think that if we were to look at the system of slavery, we have to also look at the system that is informing slavery, or in the system that's informing the prison system, which is our economic system. Or look at this.
Right.
The there's more prisons, there's more private prisons traded on the stock market than ever before. Now, people are investing in private prisons, and
right.
why?
I think that's a huge topic of its own. The concept of the prisons. But I did promise Basiyr Dbba, I was gonna come back to you. Now I've heard this argument, believe it or not, when people do say that Black people now should be grateful because of America is this great nation, that their ancestors went through a lot of rough things, like other nations went through slavery too. Black people aren't the only people, but they should be grateful that now they're born, their ancestors came to the United States, and now it's this great thing that they should be grateful for what America has provided for them. Otherwise they would have been stuck in the poverty of Africa. What do you think about that?
Well, I'll answer it. I won't call it ignorant, but I'll answer it. So I think quickly to kind of backtrack and go forward, though, right? I think that my brothers here are painting a very clear picture, if we can see it, that what has happened in the history of the United States is that as Black people have taken, Barack Obama described it this way in one of his speeches. If we take 2 steps forward, then somehow the system pushes us 10 steps back, right? And that's the nature of the design of the system. And so I'll answer this question and kind of run back to the first question that you asked me about the ending of slavery, right? And why it's significant to understand what happens there. So in 1865, the Emancipation Proclamation is put forward in 1861. By 1865, the Civil War is at an end. And then all across the South, Black people are supposedly free. But we discover that Union troops have to enforce that freedom, because if they don't enforce that freedom, then some Black people aren't even told that they are actually free, right? And so Union troops enforce freedom at the point of a gun, basically. Now, having enforced this freedom at the point of a gun, right around the same time, 1865, an amendment gets passed called the 13th Amendment, right? And the 13th Amendment says, listen, slavery is no longer allowed in the United States, nor any form of involuntary servitude, except if it's a punishment for a crime, right? So that gives the slaveholders the out they need, because they're like, oh, except in the punishment for a crime. And so what they then do is they create this insidious system of criminalizing Black behavior. So as we were hearing earlier, as our people were talking about, you committed small crimes, and then you were put on chain gangs, and then those gangs were leased, right? It's not like you were just put in some gang and locked in jail. Understand that the American prison system from its inception puts people to work and then accrues the funds from the work into the hands of the owners of the prison. That's how it began. It began with those gangs of that were where we, and I want to be clear here too, so people understand. You didn't have to commit any infractions, right? So you didn't have to do anything. If you were a Black person and you were leaving the South because of the virulent racism of the South, the lynchings of the South, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in the South, which happens after 1865 en masse, right? And you start leaving, you're like, look, I got to get out of this. I need a future for myself and my family. You're heading north. And you walk through certain towns, you start to see these signs pop up, right? And these signs say, look, if you are the N-word, don't let the sun catch you here, right? So you heading out, you're trying to get, and you find yourself on these roads, you just kind of lost and heading out, and then they just grab you, right? For no reason. Boy, where you going? Where you coming from?
That's like a crime.
Absolutely. You're walking, right? Walking while Black. Right, where you going? I'm heading, I'm down here in Texas. I'm heading up to Arkansas. I'm going north to New York. Oh, you some uppity Negro. You can't go to no New York. You belong down here, and you're not leaving either. And that's it. That's it. That person gets locked up for anything. In the state of Missouri where we live, they created what they call pig laws. These are like small, pretty larceny laws, right? You didn't have to do anything. You just walked. And somebody walked up and say, that Negro who's walking by stole something from my farm. Didn't steal anything from your farm, just walking through. Now you got caught up in a chain gang, right? And that happened across the South. It was terrorism against Black people on a massive scale. And so when we say, again, the end of slavery, the 13th Amendment was supposed to end slavery and involuntary servitude in the United States in 1865. It was not until 1965 that another law had to be written that said, look, you can't force people back into anything like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But even in 65, when that was passed, notice what we have now. We have the highest incarceration rate of people in the United States, period. And that is Black and brown people, right? That is Black, African-Americans, Hispanics, and other people of color are all caught up in the American prison system. That didn't end. So if you ask, when you're asking the first question, well, when did slavery end in America? Theoretically, it didn't really end. Involuntary servitude didn't end in America, right? It was held in check by certain things, but even now, what's a 3 strikes law? How many people in the 80s and the 90s were locked up in America's prisons for life or for 20 years because of the 3 strikes laws of the 80s and the 90s that said if you got caught on a 3rd crime and you had 2 before, we would just throw the full book at you, right? So you got caught on something, again, something minor or nothing, and then it turns out you ended up in prison forever. So I think that has to be clear. We have to clear that up so people understand that that period didn't end, right? So the second thing, quickly before I run to the other thing, like, what's the story about, we're free now and we should, we're in America or we're in the West. And I like to paint this picture too, because I like to push back on the idea, and I have to do this. I like to push back on the idea that somehow Black people that were enslaved in the United States had this largely distinct reality from Black people that were enslaved in Brazil, that were enslaved in Haiti, that were enslaved in other parts of the Caribbean, whether English or Dutch speaking, right? During the time when slavery was at its peak, there were no geographical borders except if you belonged in the European house from which your people came, right? So African Americans were under British slavery. The slaves, so the Africans were taken from Africa. They were taken into the Caribbean to places like Jamaica, where I'm from. There were attempts to break them there, and that was what they said, break them there, and then they would distribute them to the other parts of the English-speaking world. Towards the end of slavery, and this has to be clear too, towards the end of slavery after 1808, that significant period that I mentioned, slaves had to be bred, they had to be bred in the Caribbean. They were bred in places like Antigua and Barbados and then sent forward to other places. Everybody's talking about things like, the Alexander Hamilton musical that's making the rounds, right? Where was Hamilton born? He was born in the Bahamas, right? Because during that period of time, there was great syncretism across the language group to which you belong. If you're a slave if you are a slave in Haiti and the Haitian Revolution kicks off in 1800, Haiti was the first Black republic in the world where Black people freed themselves from French slavery. Where did those slaves and their masters go? Do we know where they went? They left Haiti. They were dragged out of Haiti because the slaves had never freed themselves. Africans had freed themselves. The white slave masters were trying to save any little they had. They ran away. Where did they go? They didn't go back to France. You know where they went? They came to New Orleans. They came to the United States. So we have to understand that we came over. I have a sister that lives in Jamaica, a lady that lives in Jamaica. She was born here in the United States. She's an African American in that regard, and she lives with us here in Jamaica. And she said, there is no distinction between you and us. We all came over on the same slave ships, right? So we have to be very clear about that notion. Yes.
Yeah. Let me come to
hold that last question though, because I want to answer it. Hold it. Yes.
Okay. Abdullah, we hear this a lot. Other nations have also been oppressed. It wasn't only Black people in America who were oppressed, but people say, they managed to move on. Japan was bombed, in the Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they came out of it. The Indians, they came out of it. I mean, every nation seems to come out of it, and they're booming. They're doing so well. Slavery happened such a long time ago. Why can't Black people just move on, for God's sake? Why can't they just, okay, what happened. Let's just do it now. What's holding you back? Can you tell us, why do we keep talking about this?
Yes, very, very quickly. I just want to go back. And
if we keep going back, we have 20 minutes.
I know, just 20 minutes, real quick. Right, so I was speaking specifically of criminality as a result of intentional economic sabotage, right? I didn't get the chance to talk about just criminalization of Blackness, right? Which Brother Basiyr Rodney covered. So alhamdulillah, jazakallah for covering that, right? So that was a whole nother beast within itself. So asking your question, to answer your question regarding what happened with Japan, what happened with the Native Americans, internment camps, so on and so on and so forth, right? Again, it comes down to economics. These brothers and sisters that were oppressed by the United States received some sort of recompense, whether it was reparations, whether it was some sort of funding that continues until this present day. They were given an economic infrastructure, and they were given access to it, and they were able to build their own system. And once that system was built, it wasn't directly undermined, right? So the foundational Black American has an incredibly unique experience. We haven't received recompense. We haven't received reparations. The 40 acres and a mule that we were promised as descendants of slaves or freed slaves, that never came about. It never took place, right?
So is that Japanese or other Blacks?
I'm sorry?
Is that Japanese or other Black people receiving these reparations?
The Japanese, right? Native Americans, right? They're receiving reparations. As far as Black Americans, we have not received any sort of recompense, any monetary recompense or reparations. We have received some apologies, right? Some Aunt Jemima got removed. Aunt Jemima got removed from, the maple syrup canister. They're going to play the Black national anthem at, the NFL. But this is not what we're at. This is not going to affect systemic change.
Right.
We need something concrete for the Black community so we can build an economic infrastructure. And if you don't, as a country, want to give us that, let us alone and use our $1.3 trillion spending power to develop our own, right? But then again, we're caught in a situation where if we talk about as a Black community, kind of separating ourselves and creating our own economic infrastructure, then we're accused of being racist, and why don't we just want to be with everybody, right? So we're caught in this we're caught in a very precarious position, right? If we want to integrate, we're told just integrate our way, right? Integrate in the white American way. If we're told we want to separate, then we're told we're racist, we're separatists, we're segregationists, right? So we're caught in a very, very tough position as a Black community.
Wow, that's an awesome way of putting it. So Manantab, I know we're talking about the history here. We're trying to dig up, and it kind of gets, some people may be thinking, come on, like, why do we have to even talk about this? We know that it happened. It's been acknowledged over and over again. We're in 2020. If we want to have a conversation about, getting rid of racism, let's talk about what's happening now. Why do we need to talk about, slavery and what happened right after slavery? People who may not understand the dynamics of the things may just say, well, that's knowledge, that's history, fine. But like, let's talk about what's happening now. Why do we have to educate people about the history?
Because I think we're repeating all of this over and over again. If you don't understand history, you're going to fail to understand it in the future. You're definitely going to repeat it, and we all know that. But I think that the need to talk about slavery, maybe someone doesn't. Let's talk about right now, right? Let's not talk about slavery. Let's talk about equity versus equality, right? Let's talk about how when we came here, we didn't have anything, and we still don't have anything. We have absolutely zero. Abdul-Hai said, he just so eloquently put it, that everyone else got paid. Everyone else got paid through some type of economic structure that they formed and fashioned, just like they did the however many trillions of dollars to bail people out of the poverty straits that they were headed for during this particular time period during the pandemic. That's giving people some type of equity, right? Not just equality, because if you look at equality, even during that period of times for during the pandemic, some people got paid more and some people got paid less. $1,200 versus $65 million for a CEO of a company that's headed for bankruptcy. That's a lot of money, right? So if we don't want to talk about slavery, And even if we do, let's talk about equity versus equality. Let's see if we can, even the playing field. Let's start on the same exact playing field that everyone else starts on, and then we'll see who winds up first, second, or third. But no one, the problem is no one wants to address in this space and time the equity, because no one wants to give us the brand new tools that we were supposed to have when we were free, right? And so then now you have the question. Now they dumbed it down to equality. No, that's not the issue, because we're in Allah's eyes, we're all equal. As a matter of fact, and I'll push even further the ticket of segregation. In reality, we should have been, and we should be pushing for some type of separation of our race of people. Not to say, hey, you know what, we're going to separate and be racist, right? But we're going to understand who we are first. We're going to divide into our sub-tribes and our tribes and sub-tribes, so we understand, so we'll know who we are, and then we can find the beauty in us, and then move forward to find the beauty in other people. The goal of integration was almost that way, was to find the beauty in other people, but we went and said, hey, we want to find the beauty in you, and we also want to be like you.
Right.
And that in turn destroyed the Black community up to right now, and we're still trying to find ourselves. Right.
So I'll come, that same question that I posed to you, Basiyr Saab, if I come to you, we have a whole lot of kind of people, watching this session right now, people who are African American, European, Pakistani origin. If somebody asks this session, we're going through the history, why do we have to go, what do you gain from going through the history? Like if you have a friend that's Black, why do you have to know their history, right? So can you tell us a little bit about the importance of having this session and talking about history, really, for people to understand it and how it would affect now? Basiyr Saab, you're muted.
Because A, we live in a racist society, and people have to understand why, right? So if any one of us can go to any one of the Rust Belt industrial cities, one of the things we do, my wife and I, sometimes as we travel around the country, is we go to just the Martin Luther King Boulevard of the town, which typically goes through the African American neighborhood, right? And what we discover really quickly is that those areas are very much depressed, right? When you look at our education system and you see the extent to which our African American kids are not being serviced, those are going to raise questions for any well-thinking person. When you drive through a town or a city and you see that there's this particular group of people that are living on the floor, you have to ask yourself why. And if you're talking, like you said, on this call might be a bunch of immigrants, right? So you have our African brothers who are coming, they're coming to America to get the benefits of America, right? And the economic benefit and the social elevation. You have our Asian brothers, our Pakistani brothers, our Indian Bengali brothers, they're coming for the same thing. So they're asking themselves every day when they look at our communities and our realities, well, if we come to get it, why can't you achieve it? So in order to understand why that is, they must be able to see that there have been protracted attempts to deny our ability and the ability of African Americans living in the country to be able to achieve those things, right? That every successive generation have to rebuild, for example, Black wealth. Every successive generation must rebuild Black education. Every generation has to do that. In the meantime, other groups, for example, obviously white people, the majority don't have to do that. They just keep passing down wealth from one generation to the next, right?
Even
you
the
own a house,
right?
You had to your son, right? Many immigrants are now benefiting from that, but I want us to be very cautious of that, because the fact is, in the second generation, once you come from the Black world, in the second generation, your children also fall under the same kinds of systems of African Americans. Right? When the police put me and my father down on the floor in Fort Lauderdale and put their knees in our backs and put the guns at our heads, they didn't ask us if we were Jamaican, and it was me and my father. We talk about that every day. They don't ask that question. They're like, we heard that 2 black people were down the street. You walked into the donut shop. One of them had a gun. We think it's you two, and that was it. So in the second generation, for sure, the black people are treated exactly the same way. They didn't ask Amadou Diallo whether he was from West Africa before they killed him, before they attacked him the way they attacked him and beat him ruthlessly, right? So we have to be very careful to think that, we know as a fact that African Americans born in the country have some peculiar challenges that they face. But the fact is, all of us as Black people have been victims of the same kind of system the longer we remain here. And those of us from the Caribbean kind of all fall into the same boat, right? Quickly on the question of reparations and who got money. Japan, the example people sometimes use, got $6 billion from the Marshall Plan. Europe got over 60 billion American dollars from the United States government under the Marshall Plan to rebuild after World War II. Some of that money went directly to Japan. When America went to Korea to fight the Korean War, the munitions that were used to fight that war were manufactured in Japan. Today, there are many Americans who will drive a Toyota and drive a Honda and drive no other car. How did that happen? Japan was given preferential treatment when it came to the manufacturing of their vehicles in the United States and the selling of their vehicles in the United States. No African country has gotten anything like that, right? Haiti, like I said, I use Haiti as an example, that freed itself in 1800 on the back of the American Revolution and the French Revolution. Black people in this hemisphere freed themselves. And what happened? To secure that freedom, every single year they had to pay to keep it. They kept writing checks to France until the 1940s, the 1950s, right?
So hold on. So you're saying these other people had a kind of, okay, we are sorry for what we did. Here's 60 billion and here's this, that, and the third. And for the Black people in America, they had to pay for that freedom?
For the Black people in Haiti had to pay. Absolutely. Black people in Haiti had to pay for that freedom. Even right now in West Africa, the currency of the French-speaking countries is a currency that is controlled by France, right? It's not a currency that's controlled by Africans, a currency controlled by France. So that was a system that had been set up, and it remains that system to this day, where Black people are under the feet of white people globally. To answer one of the questions you posed, would we have been better off in Africa? That's not even a sensible question from simply the standpoint that when you read a lot of the scholarship, what we learn is that while Africa was being depeopled, and some of the best and brightest minds were being taken out of Africa over a 300-year period and carted off into the Western Hemisphere. Remember, they were not taking, no disrespect to our elderly, but they were not taking the old ladies and they were not taking the old men. They were taking young people who could walk 200 miles to a boat, survive a month-long journey across the ocean, and then work on a plantation. They were taking the best out of Africa. So when you're taking that group of people out of a continent, you set up that continent to be in the circumstance it's in now. That poverty you talk about, all that you talk about, is in part because Africa was being depeopled, right? And then creating this setup here. And the fact of the matter is, if you know people can comfortably be able to get past the fact that for 400 years your whole life was disrupted. Right. I say this about English-speaking Blacks in this hemisphere, right? English-speaking Blacks in this hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere, are the only group of Blacks that I know of that speak only one language.
Yep.
Yeah.
Every other group of Africans are multilingual. We are multilingual people. And it's so bad for us sometimes that when we ask our children to learn any other language, whether it's an African language or Arabic or Spanish or French, they look at us and say, we don't want to learn that stuff. We talk English. But all our DNA, the oldest DNA on earth from which we come, our peoples are multilingual. Our
right.
African brothers and sisters speak 5-6 languages. So when that disruption.
Go ahead, Brother Sabi.
Let me add something to that.
Right.
Basiyr Rodney had highlighted something really interesting.
We have 5 minutes, by the way.
All right, real quick. So for Ahmadi Muslims, we helped establish a stronghold of Islam here in America, and it was the resurgence of Ahmadiyya Islam here in America through Mufti Muhammad Sadiq, may God rest his soul. But we also, let's go back and talk about, if we want to talk about slavery, we want to talk about the inception, right? We want to talk about how the Moors went over to Spain during the 700 AD and conquered Spain, but then also towards the end materialized to the point where they just gave up the entire kit and caboodle, right? And so during that period of time, the Henry the Explorer during 1444 came to Africa, the west coast of Africa, went back to his kingdom and said, hey, you know what? There's a lot of people, there's a lot of wealth and resources there in Africa. What should we do? His king said, hey, you know what? You can have 300 miles of the coast of West Africa, beginning the inception, the seeds of slavery from that point on. And from that point on, the Congo, everything fell to everyone in Europe. Not only did it fall, but then the Muslims in those areas started to fall right along with it and started to become materialized into becoming Christian and so on and so forth.
Right.
So
I'm so tempted to continue going. We have 3 minutes, unfortunately, and I know this is, again, we're not here to say that we're going to cover everything that is the history of Black people. No. Don't expect that. If you're going to expect that, we're going to be terrible failures. This is just to give you a little bit of a tip of the iceberg. And as you can see, it's hard to control this conversation. Brother Abdul-Hai, you have your hand up. Yes, please, your last comment before we get
I know we were supposed to get to this point, but I want to get to it very, very quickly. Mm-hmm. And this is a sentiment that I hear often within non-Ahmadis, Ahmadis, non-PAMA and PAMA members. And there's a statement, well, what about Black on Black crime, right? I just want to bring attention to this statement. I really don't understand how one can be an Ahmadi Muslim and use that statement as a way to justify what's happening. Because that statement is just bolstering and augmenting the state-sanctioned killings by the government and the government overreach. Black on Black crime, right, this whole sentiment that people say, right, is not a reality, simply because crime is a reflection of proxemics. So naturally, if Black community lives closer to each other and that economic infrastructure has been destroyed, naturally people have to eat, right? And immorality will lead you to more immorality, plain and simple, right? We don't ever talk about white on white crime, Asian on Asian crime, Latino on Latino crime. This whole sentiment of Black on Black crime is used and brandished as a way to undermine what's happening to the Black community in regard to the disparity of Black people being killed and also the disparity of police brutality, right? Brother Basiyr has told a story. Marabi Saab, you have stories, I have stories, Manan has stories. We all have stories of just existing and police escalating stuff, not only approaching you, but escalating stuff when they should be de-escalating, because that should be their profession, unless they are entrenched in the inception of the slave patrols, which is the origin of the police, by the way, right? I'm sure most of us should know that by now. We've mentioned it many, many times. So again, I just want to go back and just say one more time, right. This whole idea of Black on Black crime is a myth. And if you use it, I challenge you. I challenge you to really rectify that statement as an Ahmadi Muslim, because if you perpetuate that statement, you are perpetuating injustice. Just because Black people may kill each other due to having an economic infrastructure that's been sabotaged does not give the state the right to kill people, plain and simple. And again, if you say that, you are perpetuating injustice.
So that's a nice cliffhanger. As I said, today's session was mainly focused on the history, just to touch on it, to talk about, and again, Basiyr Saab, as you mentioned, this is in order to understand a people, in order to understand, having a conversation with somebody, you need to be able to know their way of thinking to a certain level. And that includes their history. What is it that this person went through? Why is it that I act a certain way? You know, so this is a completely new person that you're meeting. So knowing somebody's history, especially in the country that you find yourself in, is extremely important. So that's what we're trying to get at by scratching just the surface. And again, this is a lifetime conversation. It's not a 1 hour, 2 hour, 10 hour conversation, but we will be bringing more of these to you. Today's lesson was mainly, today's discussion was mainly focused on the history. Next Monday, we'll be here at the same time, and we'll be sharing a different perspective. A cliffhanger, we'll be talking about the civil rights movement and some of the efforts that the Black people did to try their best to bring about some sort of change, and how as you talk about slavery, it's so obvious that slavery was bad, but then you'll be surprised some of the things that happened to keep that system in place until now that we're seeing police brutality or something of that sort. But to keep to our promise, I'll pass it over to Azam Akram Saab, who was the brain behind this program, to end it with silent prayers, and then we can adjourn until next week. Azam Akram Saab, Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum, jazakallah for everybody and your participation. I have surely been enriched with a lot of knowledge and also your personal experiences. May Allah allow us to understand the purpose of this Jamaat and this community, which is truly to bind hearts, despite your background, despite wherever you're from. But as the tilawat that was done from the Holy Quran, the Holy Book of Allah, God Himself has commanded us to learn and get to know each other, for the very fact that because we have been created into different types of tribes and sub-tribes. So jazakallah to everyone, all the participants. Please join me in closing and concluding this session, but not tune in next week again on Monday, same time. Please join me that may Allah bless all of us towards making this place that we live a much better place under the title of Supreme Justice. Please join me in dua. ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم آمين اللهم آمين
آمين آمين.
السلام عليكم.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله.